Unlikely Lent, Extraordinary People of the Easter Story by Rachel Billups. Chapter 3, Unlikely Freedom, pages 48 through 56. We need a scapegoat. Turn on the news, scroll your social media feed, and you will discover our deep need to have someone to blame for the pain we experience as human beings. This is an old story. This is an origin story. And this is also Jesus' story. In the Gospel of Matthew 27, Jesus had been captured by religious officials and had been then handed over to the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. The Romans occupied this territory. Although the Jews had a degree of religious freedom and acceptance, they were expected to comply with the orders and at times the whims of Rome. And although the religious officials could have had Jesus stoned if they had chosen to do so, crucifixion was more commonly practiced by the Roman Empire. Crucifixion was beyond the scope of the Sanhedrin. Pilate did not seem to know exactly what to do with Jesus of Nazareth, but Pilate could read the room and was cued into the fact that this crowd needed someone to blame. Now, at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. Matthew 27, verses 15 through 18. Life for regular folk in first century Judea was not exactly easy. The rich were getting richer, and the poor were barely hanging on by their fingernails. Many would-be rebels had revolted against the likes of Rome. The memory of the Maccabean revolt lingered in the minds of first-century Jews, shaping their hopes and frustrations under Roman rule. This revolt, which took place in the 2nd century BCE, was a defining moment in Jewish history. Led by Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, the Jewish rebels successfully overthrew the Greek Seleucid rulers, reclaiming and rededicating the desecrated temple in Jerusalem. Their victory, celebrated annually during Hanukkah, was more than just a military triumph. It was a testament to God's faithfulness and the possibility of liberation from foreign oppressors. For generations, this story inspired the Jewish people, serving as a powerful reminder that even against overwhelming odds, deliverance was indeed possible. However, by the time of Jesus, the power of Rome cast a far darker shadow over Jewish aspirations. The might of the Roman Empire, embodied by figures like Pontius Pilate, made the idea of an armed rebellion seem like little more than a pipe dream. Unless the Greeks, whose rule had been successfully resisted, Rome's dominance was absolute and enforced with brutal efficiency. The people longed for another Judas Maccabeus, a leader who could drive out their oppressors and restore their people's freedom. Rome was quick to keep Pax Roma, peace of Rome, and regularly used lethal force to do so. Many factions of thought emerged when attempting to understand just how to navigate Jewish identity in Caesar's territories. Perhaps you can see yourself or even your own political persuasions in these first-century Jewish sects. Each sect had its own strategy for survival under the iron grip of Rome. The Pharisees were the teachers, the interpreters of the law. They were the Jews who believed that holiness was not just for the temple, but for everyday life. Their resistance was not through words, but through meticulous obedience to Torah. These faithful adherents to the law distinguished themselves apart in devotion, hoping that if enough people practiced faithfully, maybe, just maybe, God would move. It is important to note that when reading through the New Testament, the Pharisees emerge as Jesus' biggest adversaries. Sadducees were priests, and although some were elites and temple power brokers, many lived away from Jerusalem. It was only those at the top, for example, the chief priest, and small priestly family, that held the power. They were the ones who cozied up to Rome just enough to keep the status quo. They controlled the priesthood, maintained the sacrifices, and made sure that their way of life was not disturbed. They also did not believe in resurrection, and belief in resurrection was popular among the people. It's unclear as to why the Sadducees faded from history. Perhaps if they were the aristocracy of the faith, they were wiped out by Rome in the Jewish revolt. Then there are the Essenes. Although never directly mentioned in the New Testament, John the Baptist was thought to be an Essene. These folks lived out in the desert. Their lifestyle was very similar to desert fathers and mothers of the Christian faith. The Essenes seemed to pack up, leave the city, and hunker down in the desert. They believed that if they would merely keep themselves pure and set apart, God would come and set everything right. They, too, were serious about scholarship and preserving writings. In the Qumran region, tucked into desert caves, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Scholars believed these scrolls to be the work of marginal small group of Essenes. The Essenes were waiting, writing, fasting, praying, and preparing for a divine intervention. And then there were the Zealots. The Roman Empire did not particularly appreciate the Zealots. There was mention of the Zealots in the New Testament. For example, Simon the Zealot was cited as one of Jesus' 12 disciples. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Matthew chapter 10, verses 2 through 4. In their work, The New Testament in Its World, N.T. Wright and Michael Bird questioned distinguishing zealots as a separate Jewish sect. Many scholars have long assumed some kind of zealot party that existed in the first century, to which Jesus' follower, Simon the Zealot, purportedly belonged. It appears more likely, however, that there were, throughout the first century, many movements which laid claim to the tradition of active zeal, a tradition that went back through the Maccabees to the cultural memory of Phineas and Elijah. No matter the case, zealots refused to bow, refused to compromise, and believed the only way to freedom was through revolution. Possessing daggers in their cloaks and fire in their bellies, the zealots were ready to spill Roman blood to hasten the coming kingdom of God. And Jesus of Nazareth was appealing to those with zeal, saying things like, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against his mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household." Matthew chapter 10, verses 34 through 36. Jesus sounded like a rebel. So it was no wonder zealots were attracted to Jesus. And yet when the religious leaders came to arrest Jesus, he was clear. Put away your sword. Wait a minute, Jesus. Aren't you going to fight for what is right? Even the zealots needed a scapegoat. They too wanted someone to blame. Matthew sets up the scenario known as the Paschal pardon, or the pardon at Passover. There is no documented example of this in Old Testament or even in other Jewish literature of a Paschal pardon. Seemingly, these kinds of pardons are a Roman practice, or possibly more ancient than that penned in Babylonian lore. And Matthew pointed to the choice at hand. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" Matthew 27, verse 17. A choice between two Jesuses, Jesus the Messiah or Jesus Barabbas. Jesus Barabbas is the man we know so little about, yet his name echoes through the Passion story like a haunting refrain. The gospel writers tell us he was a notorious prisoner. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas, Matthew 27, verse 16. Or Barabbas was an insurrectionist. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder during the insurrection, Mark chapter 15, verse 7. He was labeled a murderer in the Gospel of Luke. This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Luke chapter 23, verse 19. It's clear Barabbas was a rebel against Rome. But was he more than just a common criminal? Some scholars speculate he was a zealot. If that's true, then the choice Pilate offered was not just between two men. The choice was between two visions of salvation. Barabbas embodied the fight for your life, take up arms, let's kill our way to freedom mindset that some believed was the only way out from under Caesar's thumb. Can you imagine what Barabbas was thinking? Perhaps he wanted to be there, detained by the likes of Rome. Inspired by the crowd, he was not asking for a pardon. No way! Barabbas knew what he had signed up for. He wanted to die a martyr's death. Barabbas was fighting for the very people he sought to protect from Rome. If I could get in Barabbas's head, perhaps I would find that there was pride for what he had done. Maybe he thought to himself, I fought my way to be here. I know why I am standing before the people, but what about this Jesus of Nazareth? What did this guy do to tick off this crowd? What if Barabbas was tired of occupation? What if he was weary of oppression, of living under the crushing weight of a foreign empire, dictating his every move? Could it be that Barabbas was not merely a criminal, but a man desperate for agency over his own life? Or someone who saw no other way but violence to reclaim what had been stripped from him? In his eyes, perhaps he was not a rebel, but a freedom fighter, driven by a conviction that resistance, even through force, was the only path to justice. His actions led him to prison, facing the inevitable consequences of his choices, and yet, at the last moment, he was spared. But what if, in that moment of release, he was forced to confront an even deeper battle within himself? What if Barabbas, standing in the presence of Jesus, felt a shame he had never expected? What if, rather than dying for what he had fought for, he was left to wrestle with the reality that someone else was taking his place? Did he wonder whether his cause had been in vain? Did he feel resentment that he had been freed while Jesus, a man who preached peace rather than violence, was condemned? Could it be that, like so many others, he turned on Jesus, seeking someone to blame for his inner turmoil? I am not justifying Barabbas' crime, but rather I am naming the undeniable truth that many are willing to fight, even to the point of death, for what they believe is right, especially when they are fueled by anger, fear, or both. What if now Barabbas has to live with the grief that he failed his cause, and in his shame, he wanted someone to blame? We are always looking for someone to blame, a place to unload the twisted feelings we experience when tragedy or hardship strikes. When a mass shooting occurs, the media and the public quickly speculate, debating whether the problem lies in mental health, gun laws, or societal decay. Instead of pausing to grieve or understand, many rush to assign fault, hoping that if they can name the cause, they can regain a sense of control. The same thing happens when a plane crashes. Immediate blame is cast on pilots, faulty aircraft design, or even meteorologists who fail to predict hazardous weather. Rather than acknowledging the complexity of such events, our culture demands a scapegoat, someone to bear responsibility for our fear and helplessness. This impulse to assign blame is deeply ingrained in our human nature and extends far beyond major national tragedies. When the economy struggles, we blame politicians, immigrants, or large corporations for taking away jobs. If a sports team loses a crucial game, fans blame the coach, the referees, or even a single player who made a mistake. As a major fan of the Ohio State Buckeyes, I know this reality all too well. After the OSU football team lost to the Michigan Wolverines for the fourth year in a row, many took to verbal violence against head coach Ryan Day and his family. Rumors swirled that even teachers accosted his children in their classrooms. Day was forced to hire extra security for his family home because the threat was so intense. Humans need someone to blame. When our teams are losing, our livelihood is threatened, our family is in danger, and our reputation is on the line, we instinctively look for someone to accuse. It's easier to point fingers than to sit with discomfort, uncertainty, or the possibility that some problems have no easy solution. Blame gives us a false sense of resolution, but it rarely leads to healing or real change. Back in God's garden in Genesis, God has called Adam and Eve out for hiding. God wanted to stay in relationship with Adam and Eve. But in their shame, Adam and Eve were quick to blame. The man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate." Then the Lord God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent tricked me, and I ate." Genesis chapter 3, verses 12 through 13. The exchange between Adam and Eve and God could seem comical if it did not ring true of our human experience. Blame seems like the best way out. We need a scapegoat. But then, in a strange twist of events, Jesus flips the script, taking the shame and blame onto himself.